Okay, so it's a little longer and not safe for work. But you guys are at work. They're no little shorter. Okay. It's called Live Nude Models. And it's just an out-and-out memoir piece. There's something I found that, when you read something on the page, you always, your eye can see that there's some white space at the end and start to know when the end is coming, and you can make yourself ready. And I always feel that there's a disadvantage reading pieces that finish because they suddenly finish and the reader hasn't had that white space. So I'm going to read you the last few lines of this piece first. And then we'll get to them. Okay, so you'll have that feeling of getting there. The last couple of lines are, we 30-odd teenagers drew her, the whole of us sober, respectfully hushed. A trace bored if you were me, but anyhow living up to the teacher's expectation. But I do remember thinking, I know and they don't. I remember thinking, they'll think they're all that way. Okay, that's the end. Live nude models. Be careful what you wish for. You may turn out already to have had it. That's to say, had it before you could make intelligible use of it, perhaps before you could get your synapses to parse it for what it was. By the time I was 17 years old and had a girlfriend who would take her clothes off, I'd been envisioning women with their clothes off, ravishing them with the secret lidless eyeball of my brain for at least 5 years. Though these were 5 long, aching years, which I took entirely personally at the time, I do realize how mundane such a confession must be. There wasn't anything baroque or complicated in my pining visualizations or the procedure by which I took their edge off, and it's surely the case that a savvy person glancing my way would guess I did pretty well nothing else around that time. Here's what's special. In that same span, through my rude, ripened, teen prime years, there were live nude models appearing nightly in my home. Women to whose unclad form my ordinary eyeballs had regular access. My father painted them upstairs in his studio. Through those years, nudes were the main subject of his large oils on canvas, of which he painted dozens, sometimes from memory or from studies, but often with the body present before him, as well as generating many hundreds of nudes on paper or vinyl in pencil, oil crayons, or gouache, or combinations of those mediums. Nearly each and every one of which was done in the presence of what at 8 or 10 I would have still called a naked lady. Me? What did I do? I opened the door to his studio. I walked through. My father's studio was part of our home. I did this probably beginning at 12 or 13, when I would have learned to refer to the naked ladies in question as models, as in a mock casual formation like, we can hang out in the kitchen, my dad's up with one of his models. Or the defensively sophisticated, sure, I see the models with their clothes off. It's no big deal. I do recall forming sentences like these, just as I recall the slightly widened eyes of the models themselves a few times as they met the eyes of the would-be jaded 12-year-old who pushed through the door without knocking. I can also bring up a good portion of ambiance, the musty throw rugs and scarred chairs and hand-carpentered easels, the exposed brick wall, the upright wood-burning stove my father installed, the jazz or blues, or leftist news and culture gab of WBAI seeping from the boombox, the savor of brushes marinating in turpentine, and tangy odor of the cake of lava soap, the only brand, my father explained, that would gently strip oil paint from human skin. The bulletin board layered with valentines from my mother and with enigmatic newspaper clippings that would inspire paintings of my father's. What I can't supply, despite the clamor I by now imagine I hear from my reader on this point, is account of any parent-child consultation on the topic of the models and how I was or wasn't supposed to feel about them. I can't supply these because I'm fairly certain they didn't occur. Nudity is okay, like Nixon is a vampire or grown-ups smoke pot, was a truth floating in our house. The sort of truth I gradually inferred was somewhat more true inside our doors than out. I not only glimpsed the models. At 12 or 13, I declared myself an apprentice artist and began to draw them myself. Not in the studio upstairs, in our own house. I went along with my dad on drawing group nights to the home of his artist friends, Bob and Cynthia, who lived in a loft space on Atlantic Avenue with square footage enough for a model to stand, encircled by 7 or 8 artists, sitting with sketch pads braced on crossed legs or seated before small easels. Specifically, 7 adult artists and 1 teenager, me. I began before high school. I know this for certain because there were nudes in the portfolio of sketches I used to win entry into the High School of Music and Art later that year. I was a regular at drawing group for 3 years, I'd guess. By the time I was 16, I was done hanging out with my dad, for a while at least. But for 3 years, I soaked my eyeballs in live flesh. Not even a kid who'd grown up in a nudist colony could have been invited to stare like I stared. After all, I was an artist. No one balked at my presence. This was 1977, 1978. The models, so far as I can rely on these memory tendrils I'm chasing, were blasé. These were mostly art students themselves, settled into an easy, if boring, gig. Likely, posing for a group of men and women together was more comfortable, generally, than making a private exhibition for a solitary male artist. And the evenings at Bob and Cynthia's were convivial. The routine followed the lines of every life drawing class since the publication of Kimon Nicolaides' The Natural Way to Draw, and probably long before it. A series of rapid-fire poses so the artist could loosen with gestural sketches, then 5 or 10-minute poses, then a few held long enough for a study. Also long enough that the model might need to pause or stretch, or even don a robe and take a 5-minute break before resuming. Between poses, the artists wandered to see others work, and I did this too. Sometimes the models roamed too in their robes. Other times they were uninterested in the results. I worked with craypas or gray or colored pencil or compressed charcoal, and, less often, painted in watercolor and gouache. I was less patient than the adults. I was there learning patience as much as anything. And I remember feeling finished with studies before the longer poses were done, and then watching the clock. Apart from that lapse, I worked in absorption. And as with all absorbing work since, I recall precisely 0 from the mental interior of the experience. What I wasn't doing, I'd know, was mental slavering. The Tex Avery wolf of sexual voraciousness not only restrained his eyeballs from first swelling like dirigibles and then bursting like loaded cigars, he slept. Any account of the evolutionary hardwiring of lust is stuck, I guess, dismissing me now as an outlier or just a liar. The super extensive actuality of women's bodies before my eyes was either too much or too little for me to make masturbatory mincemeat of. Both too much and too little. The scrutiny was too much and the context too little. I don't mean they weren't sexy bodies. I'd guess they were. But Jonathan seeing them wasn't sexy at all. Even as I recorded with my charcoal or crayon the halo of untrimmed pubic bush and the flesh braid of mystery that it haloed, I attained a total non-purchase on those bodies as objects of desire. The Palace of Lust was a site under construction. That's what I was doing at night or in the afternoons, fantasizing about girls I knew who'd never even show me their knees. At those moments, I slavered plenty. Did I, in my imaginings, substitute for my non-girlfriend's unconquerable forms the visual stuff I'd been gleaning at drawing group? Nope. As much as a t-shirt's neckline or tube top's horizon might seem a cruel limit to my wondering gaze, I didn't want my imagination to supply the pink pebbly fact of aureole and nipple, like those I'd examined under bright lights for hours at a time. It wasn't that I found real women's bodies unappetizing, but that I just didn't have any use for them in the absolute visual sphere within which I'd gained access. It was too soon. Much like a person who's disappointed or confused at seeing the face attached to the voice of a radio personality well known to their ears, and then realizes that no face would have seemed any more appropriate. I suspect I didn't really make mental nudie shots of girls my age. I didn't picture them undressed. I imagined undressing them, and the situations in which such a thing would be imaginable. My eyeballs wanted to be fingertips. I was a romantic. A romantic teenage boy, that is. My romance encompassed a craving for illicit glimpses, not due to a lack of visual information, but as rehearsals of transgression and discovery. A craving for craving, especially in the social context of other teenage boys, that mass of horny romantics. But we're talking about a terrible low point in the history of teenage access to pornography. Everyone's dads had canceled their Playboy subscriptions in a feminist epiphany a few years before. And the internet was a million miles away. A friend and I were actually excited when we discovered a cache of back issues of Sexology, a black and white crypto-scientific pulp magazine, in the plaster and lathe of a ruined brownstone on Wyckoff Street. Pity us. When a couple of snootily gorgeous older teenage girls suddenly moved into the upper duplex of a house on Dean Street, there was some talk among the block's boys about climbing a nearby tree so we could leer into their window. A notion as halcyon as anything in my childhood. Point is, I was as thrilled to imagine glimpsing the sisters as any of the other schemers. I could very well have gone off to drawing group the evening of that same day, but I made no mental conjugation between the desired object and the wasted abundance before me. Only two uneasy memories bridge this gulf. Between the eunuch child who breezed through a world of live nude models and the hormonal disaster site I was the rest of the time. One glitch was the constant threat or promise that a drawing group model would cancel at the last minute, since tradition had it that one of the circle would volunteer for duty instead. Two of the group's members were younger women, named, incredibly enough, Laurel and Hazel, for whom I harbored modest but definite boy-to-woman crushes, and with whom I might have managed even to be legibly flirtatious. If one evening a model had canceled and either Hazel or Laurel took her clothes off, I'd have been pitched headfirst into the chasm of my disassociation. I never faced this outcome. The only substitute model ever to volunteer on my watch was our host, the hairily cherubic Bobby Ramirez. But I would never forget what hadn't happened, who hadn't undressed. You may choose to see this as evidence against my assertion that the scene was not a sexual one for me. I choose to see it as certifying proof of my capacity for fantasizing about clothed women at the exact instant I ignored naked ones in the center of my vision. The second slippage took place not at drawing group, but in my room with my friend Carl. We were 14. Carl and I usually drew superhero comics together. But this afternoon, deep into the porn drought of the 70s, we drifted into trying to produce our own fantasy females. At one point, Carl reached an impasse in his attempt to do justice to the naked lady in his mind's eye, and let me analyze the problem. Yes, the nipples were too small and placed too high on the gargantuan breasts Carl had conjured up. He'd also too much defaulted to the slim, squared-off frame of the Superman we'd been compulsively perfecting. Do you mind, I asked. Taking the drawing from Carl, I compacted and softened the torso and widened the hips, gave his fantasy drawing volume and weight, splitting the difference between the unreal ratio and something more persuasive. He'd handed me a teenage boy's fantasy, and I, a teenage boy, passed back a woman, even if it was one who'd need back surgery in the long run. Carl and I were both, I think, unnerved by this, and we never returned to this exact pursuit. Our next crack at do-it-yourself porn was Retrograde and Bawdy, a comic called Super Dick, with images that were barely better than stick figures. Confessing for the first time my authorship of Super Dick, I'm flabbergasted. Not at the dereliction of parental authority that would traipse nude women past the gaze of a boy still excited to sketch with ballpoint pen a hieroglyphic cock and balls in cape and boots, but at the Mobius strip of consciousness which enabled that boy to walk around believing himself a single person instead of 2 or 100. If I've bet my life's work on a suspicion that we live at least as much in our wishes and dreams, our constructions and projections, as we do in any real waking life, the existence of which we can demonstrate by rapping it with our knuckles, perhaps my non-utilization of the live nude models helped me place this bet. How could I ever be astonished to see how we human animals slide into the vicarious at the faintest invitation, leaving vast flaming puddings of the real uneaten. For I did that. My last year at Music and Art, a teacher booked a nude model for us to draw in an advanced drawing class, one consisting only of graduating seniors. By chance, this was the last time I'd ever sketched from a nude model, though I couldn't have known it at the time. By implication, this was a privilege we seniors had earned after 4 years of art school, to be treated like adults. Still, there was plenty of nervous joking in the days before, and when the moment came, the doors and windows were kept carefully shaded against eyes other than those of us in the class. Needless to say, I felt blasé for several reasons, not least my own recent sexual initiation. I'd also begun to reformat myself as a future writer, rather than an apprentice artist. And everything to do with my final high school semester felt beneath my serious attention. Yet, ironically, I'll never forget the model that day. I remember her body when I've forgotten the others. Had forgotten them, usually, by the time I'd begun spraying fixative on my last drawing of them, before they'd finished dressing. I remember her not because she was either uncannily gorgeous or ugly, or because I experienced some disconcerting arousal, but for an eye-grabbing anatomical feature, the most protuberant clitoris I'd seen, or have since. This wasn't something I could have found the language to explain to my fellow students that day, if I'd wanted to. I didn't. The model showed no discomfort with her body. She posed beneath vile fluorescent and standing atop the wobbling, standard-issue New York Department of Education tables I'd been around my whole life to that point, the 4 legs of which never seemed capable of reaching the floor simultaneously. We 30-odd teenagers drew her, the whole of us sober, respectfully hushed. A trace bored, if you were me, but anyhow, living up to the teacher's expectation. But I do remember thinking, I know and they don't. I remember thinking, they'll think they're all that.